Need prompt for this, but need a more professional image dense after her husband passed. They mean well, they all mean well, but none of them understand that I'm not trying to get over Walter. I'm trying to figure out how to carry him with me into whatever time I have left. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September when everything changed. The weather had turned cool enough that I'd started thinking about bringing down the winter clothes from the attic. Walter always handled that task. He'd climb up there with his methodical efficiency, bringing down the labeled boxes while I sorted through them in the bedroom. But Walter wasn't here anymore, and the nights were getting cold, and I couldn't wear summer dresses forever. The attic stairs unfolded from the ceiling with a creak that echoed through the empty hallway. I climbed slowly, my knees protesting each step, my hand gripping the rail that Walter had installed 30 years ago after I'd slipped and twisted my ankle. Even now, his care surrounded me. Even now, he was looking after me. The attic smelled of old wood and stored memories. That particular scent of time passing, of things preserved but slowly aging. Light filtered through the small circular window at the far end, illuminating particles of dust that swirled as I moved through the space boxes were stacked neatly along the walls, each labeled in Walter's precise handwriting. Christmas decorations, children's school papers, photo albums 1970 to 1980. I found the winter clothes easily enough. Walter had organized everything so well that even in his absence, I could navigate his systems. But as I pulled the box toward me, I dislodged another box behind it. An unmarked box, plain brown cardboard, pushed far back against the wall where the roof sloped down low. I almost didn't investigate. I almost just pushed it back into place and went downstairs with the winter clothes. But something made me pause. In all our years together, Walter had labeled everything. Every box had a purpose clearly marked. So what was in the unmarked box? I pulled it into the light. It wasn't heavy, but it had weight to it. The cardboard was old, softened at the corners from years in the attic heat and cold. There was no tape sealing it, just the flaps tucked into each other. My hands trembled slightly as I opened them. Inside were letters, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each in its own envelope. The paper was yellowed, the envelopes addressed in Walter's unmistakable handwriting. But these weren't letters he'd received. These were letters he'd written. Letters with stamps that had never been canceled. Letters that had never been mailed. I picked up the first one my fingers touched. The envelope was addressed to someone named Thomas Brennan with an address in Portland, Oregon. I didn't recognize the name. In 53 years of marriage, Walter had never mentioned anyone named Thomas Brennan. I turned the envelope over in my hands, feeling the weight of the paper, the slight bulk of the letter inside. My heart was beating faster now. Part of me wanted to put the letter back, to close the box, to push it back into its hidden corner and pretend I'd never found it. But a larger part, the part that had lived with Walter for more than half my life, the part that thought I knew him completely, needed to understand what these letters meant. I opened the envelope carefully, my arthritic fingers fumbling with the seal. Inside were 3 pages, filled front and back with Walter's handwriting. The date at the top was March 15th, 1968, 2 years before we were married. "Dear Tommy," it began, and I sat down right there on the dusty attic floor, my back against a box of Christmas ornaments, and I began to read. The letter started with an apology. Walter was sorry he hadn't written sooner, sorry for the silence, sorry for not being there. He wrote about the weather, about starting his new job at the accounting firm, about ordinary things. But then, halfway through the second page, the tone changed. "I think about you every day," Walter had written. "I wonder where you are, if you're safe, if you remember our summers the way I do. I wonder if you hate me for what I chose, for the path I took. Sometimes I think I made a terrible mistake. Other times, I think it was the only choice I could make, but I never stop wondering what might have been different. I read those words 3 times, trying to understand them. Walter's handwriting blurred as my eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, but from confusion. Who was Tommy? What summers? What choice had Walter made? I picked up another letter, dated 6 months later, and then another, and another. The box contained years of correspondence, all addressed to Thomas Brennan, all unsent letters from 1968, 1969, 1972, 1975, scattered through the decades like breadcrumbs marking time. The most recent was dated just 3 years ago. I don't know how long I sat in that attic, reading letter after letter, watching my husband's life unfold in words he'd never intended anyone to see. The afternoon light faded, the house grew dark around me, but I couldn't stop reading. Through those letters, a story emerged. Thomas Brennan, Tommy, had been Walter's best friend since childhood. They'd grown up together in a small town in Washington state, inseparable from the time they were 6 years old. They'd shared everything: tree forts and fishing trips, high school adventures and college dreams. But Tommy was different from Walter. He was wild where Walter was cautious, adventurous where Walter was practical, artistic where Walter was analytical. After college, Tommy had wanted to travel. He'd wanted to go to Europe, to live in Paris and paint, to experience the world before settling into the expected life of career and family. And he'd wanted Walter to come with him. But Walter had obligations. His father had died, leaving his mother alone. His mother needed him. The family business needed him. And there was a girl, me, though he didn't mention my name in these early letters, a girl he'd been dating, a girl from a good family, a girl who expected certain things. In a letter dated August 1969, Walter described the choice he'd made. Tommy had left for Europe with a one-way ticket and a backpack. Walter had stayed. He'd taken the accounting job. He'd proposed to the girl. He'd done what was expected, what was right, what was responsible. "I watched your bus leave," Walter wrote, "and I felt something inside me leave with it. A possibility, a version of myself I'll never know, but I couldn't abandon my mother. I couldn't turn away from the life that was waiting for me. I couldn't be that selfish, so I let you go, and I tried to build something good with what I stayed for." I sat in the darkness of the attic, holding that letter, and I felt something crack open inside my chest. The girl he'd proposed to was me. The life he'd built was ours, and he'd described it as what he'd stayed for, as if it were a consolation prize, a second choice, a compromise. For the first time since Walter died, I felt angry with him. Not the quiet frustration of a long marriage, but real anger, hot and sharp. How dare he write these letters, pine for this other life, question the choices that led to our marriage, our children, our 53 years together? How dare he keep this box hidden, these feelings secret, while I loved him completely, while I gave him everything, while I never once doubted that we were each other's first choice? I wanted to burn the letters. I wanted to tear them into pieces and scatter them like ashes, but my hands wouldn't move, because as much as the words hurt, they were also the last pieces of Walter I would ever receive. They were his truth, even if it was a truth I'd never known existed. I must have fallen asleep in the attic because I woke to the sound of my phone ringing downstairs. My body ached from sitting on the hard floor. My neck was stiff. The letters were scattered around me where they'd fallen from my lap. I gathered them carefully, placed them back in the box, and carried it downstairs with me, along with the winter clothes I'd originally gone up to fetch. The next few days passed in a strange fog. I went through the motions of living, making coffee, eating meals I didn't taste, answering the phone when Claire called. But my mind was in that box of letters. At night, I would take out a few more and read them by the lamp in the living room, where Walter used to sit in his chair and do the crossword puzzle. The letters continued to chronicle Tommy's life from a distance. Though Tommy never responded, these letters were never sent, after all. Walter wrote as if maintaining a one-sided conversation. He described receiving a postcard from Paris, then Rome, then Madrid. He wrote about reading in the newspaper that Tommy had a gallery showing in San Francisco in 1975. He mentioned seeing Tommy's name in an art magazine in 1983, reviewing a successful exhibition. Tommy had become the artist he'd dreamed of being. He'd lived the life he'd wanted. And Walter had tracked it all, documented it all, celebrated it from afar while never making contact. However, Tommy wasn't the only subject of the letters. They were also about us, about Walter's life with me, though he rarely used my name. He wrote about our wedding, describing it as a beautiful day, and she looked so happy, and I promised myself I would make her happy every day after. He wrote about Claire's birth, the overwhelming love he'd felt holding his daughter, the terror and joy of becoming a father. He wrote about David, about buying our first house, about the ordinary accumulations of a shared life. "I chose this," he wrote in a letter dated 1972, "and most days I'm glad I did. She's a good woman. Better than I deserve. She makes me better than I would have been on my own. And when I hold our children, I can't imagine any other life, but late at night sometimes, I still wonder what you're doing, Tommy. I still wonder what I gave up." I had to stop reading then. I had to put the letter down and walk away because my hands were shaking too hard to hold the paper steady. I went to the kitchen and made tea I didn't drink. I stared out the window at the garden Walter had planted, at the roses he'd pruned every spring, at the evidence of his devotion to this life, to me. Better than I would have been on my own. As if he'd been alone before me, as if our life together had been a solitary journey he'd undertaken, as if I had been a project, an improvement, a good decision rather than the love of his life. I thought I'd known Walter completely. I thought 53 years of marriage meant there were no secrets, no hidden chambers in his heart. But these letters showed me a man I'd never seen, a man who'd sacrificed something precious, who'd spent decades wondering about the road not taken, who'd loved me truly, but perhaps not completely, not with all of himself, because part of himself had been left behind on a bus to Portland in 1969. The phone rang again. It was David this time, calling to check on me, to ask if I needed anything. I told him I was fine. I told him I was sorting through some of Dad's things. I didn't mention the letters. How could I? How could I tell my son that his father had spent their entire lives writing unsent letters to a man none of us had known existed? How could I explain that Walter had been two people, the devoted husband and father we knew, and this other person who lived in secret letters, mourning a choice made long ago? After I hung up, I went back to the box. There had to be an explanation, some letter that would make sense of all this, that would show me Walter hadn't spent our entire marriage wishing he'd made a different choice I needed to understand. The letters from the 1980s and 1990s had a different tone. Walter wrote less about regret and more about contentment. He described our silver anniversary, the trip we took to Maine, the way I'd laughed when we got lost and ended up at a lighthouse we hadn't planned to visit. He wrote about David's graduation, Claire's wedding, the grandchildren who'd begun to fill our house with noise and joy again. "I've built something good here," he wrote in 1995. "Maybe it wasn't the life I imagined when I was 22. Maybe there are paintings I'll never paint and places I'll never see. But there are also moments I couldn't have imagined. Watching my daughter walk down the aisle, teaching my grandson to fish, sitting on the porch with her on summer evenings, not needing to talk, just being together. That counts for something, Tommy. That counts for a lot. The pronouns were careful. Her. She. Never my name. As if even in these private letters, Walter couldn't quite bring himself to make me fully real, to acknowledge me as more than a presence in his narration. It stung, even as I understood he'd never intended anyone to read these words. But then I found a letter dated 2003, and everything shifted again. Tommy, it read, I saw your obituary today. 43 years after you left, and I still check the art magazines sometimes, still look for your name. And there it was, in small print. Thomas Brennan, artist, died peacefully in his home in Santa Fe at age 56, survived by his partner of 20 years, Michael, and their foster children, Anna and James. My breath caught. Tommy was dead. He'd died 15 years ago, and I'd never known, because I'd never known he existed. Walter had mourned him in secret, just as he'd loved him in secret. The letter continued. I'm glad you found love, Tommy. I'm glad you had Michael, that you built a family, that you didn't spend your life alone as I sometimes feared you might. I hope you painted everything you ever wanted to paint. I hope you saw the Louvre and the Sistine Chapel and all the beauty you used to talk about. I hope your life was full. And I need to tell you something I should have said 40 years ago. I don't regret choosing the life I chose, not anymore. Maybe I did in those first years. Maybe I mourned the loss of who I might have been. But the man I became was shaped by the choice I made. The life I built with Margaret, yes, I'll say her name now, she deserves that. The life we built together is beautiful in its own way. It's not painted on canvas, but it's painted in memories, in raised children, in a garden that blooms every spring, in 53 years of morning coffee and evening walks and hands held across the dinner table. I'm sorry I couldn't come with you. I'm sorry I chose safety over adventure. But I'm not sorry for the life I lived instead. It was a good life, Tommy. It was enough. She was enough. More than enough. She was everything, even if it took me decades to understand that. I read that letter 5 times, and each time the tears came harder. Walter had mentioned my name. He'd acknowledged what we'd built together. He'd declared, finally, that our life had been enough. But in words I was never supposed to see, he had written it to Tommy in a letter that would never be delivered. I thought about burning the letters then. I thought about putting them back in the box, pushing it into the attic's darkest corner, pretending I'd never found them. But something stopped me. These letters were Walter's truth, messy and complicated and sometimes painful, but true. And if I'd learned anything in 74 years, it was that truth matters, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. Over the next week, I read through the remaining letters, the ones written after Tommy's death. They were not like letters. They were more like journals Walter wrote about aging, about retirement, about his worries for our children and grandchildren. He wrote about his health declining, about the heart condition that would eventually take him from me. And, for the first time in his life, he wrote about me directly. In 2015, he wrote, Margaret is the strongest person I know. She doesn't see it herself. She thinks she's ordinary, thinks the life we've lived is unremarkable. But there's courage in the ordinary. There's strength in showing up every day, in loving steadily, in building something that lasts. I wish I'd told her that more. I wish I'd told her a lot of things. I had to put that letter down because my hands were shaking too badly. Walter had always been reserved with his emotions. He had demonstrated his love by taking care of the car, fixing broken items, caring for the garden, and consistently showing up. On birthdays and anniversaries, however, There had been few words of love, and yet he had expressed emotions I had never heard him express in letters that no one was supposed to read. The last letter in the box was dated just 6 months before his death. His handwriting had become more shaky, with irregular lines and sporadic trailing letters. It was short, only half a page. "Tommy," it read, "I'm dying. The doctors say 6 months, maybe a year if I'm lucky Margaret doesn't know yet. I'll tell her tomorrow, but tonight I need to say this to you first. I appreciate that you were my friend when we were younger. Thank you for wanting me to come with you, even though I couldn't. I appreciate you letting me know there were alternative lifestyles. I didn't take your path, but knowing it existed made me more than I would have been otherwise. I'm going to ask Margaret to forgive me for these letters if she ever finds them. I'm going to ask her to understand that loving her didn't mean I couldn't also mourn the person I might have been. That's the complication of being human. We can live fully in the life we chose and still wonder about the ones we didn't. Wherever you are right now, though, I want you to know this. The life I led was the right one for me. Margaret was the right choice. Our children, our grandchildren, our ordinary beautiful life. It was all exactly what I needed, even if I didn't always know it. Goodbye, old friend. Tell me about Paris when I see you again." I sobbed as I held that last letter in Walter's chair, no longer out of rage, but rather from a grief that goes beyond simple loss. I felt sorry for the young man Walter had been, forced to make an impossible decision at a fork in the road. I was saddened by the years he had spent questioning whether he had made the wrong decision. I grieved for Tommy, the friend who'd lived and died without knowing Walter had followed his life from afar. And I cried for Walter and me, for all the talks we had never had, for all the secrets we had kept because we believed they would cause more harm than good. But underneath the grief, something else was growing, perhaps understanding, or consent. The realization that love isn't simple, that it doesn't mean we erase all other feelings, all other connections, all other possibilities. Walter had carried the ghost of the life he had not lived, but he had also loved me sincerely. And maybe that was okay. Maybe that was just being human. I thought about my own secrets, the small ones I'd kept from Walter, the poetry I'd written in college and hidden away because he'd made a joke once about literary pretensions, the painting class I'd wanted to take but never mentioned because we were saving for the children's education, the friend from work, Michael, who'd asked me to lunch once and who I'd thought about, just for a moment, before saying no. We all have alternate lives we don't live, paths we glimpse and turn away from. Walter's were just more documented than most. That night, I called Claire. I could hear the background noise of the kids, the commotion in her home, and the life she had created when she responded. "Mom," she said, "is everything okay?" Telling her, "I found some letters. Letters your father wrote, but never sent." A pause occurred. Letters to who? To an old friend, someone from before he met me. I took a breath. I need to tell you about them. I need to understand them. And maybe you can help me. We talked for 2 hours. I told her about Tommy, about the choice Walter had made, about the decades of letters documenting a friendship maintained in secret. Claire listened, asked questions, cried a little. "Does it change how you think about Dad?" she finally asked. I thought about that. "It complicates things," I said slowly. "But maybe that's good. Maybe I needed to understand that he was more than just my husband. He was a whole person with his own internal life, his own struggles, his own regrets. It doesn't make me love him less. It makes him more real." "Are you going to tell David?" "I don't know yet. Maybe. Or maybe these letters are something just between your father and me. Something I need to understand before I can share them." After we hung up, I went back to the box. I pulled out the letters, spread them across the kitchen table, and began to organize them chronologically. 52 years of correspondence between 1968 and 2020. 52 years of Walter's inner life, documented and preserved. And then I did something I hadn't expected to do. I got out my own stationery, the nice paper Walter had given me for my birthday years ago, paper I'd been saving for something important. And I began to write. I began, "Dear Walter." And then I stopped. What was it I wanted to tell him? What did I need him to know, even though he'd never read these words? About locating the letters, I wrote. I wrote about the anger and confusion and hurt. Nevertheless, I also wrote about comprehension, realizing that love is complex, that everyone has regrets and losses, and that choosing one life means letting go of others. I wish you'd told me about Tommy while you were alive, I wrote. I wish we could have talked about this, could have explored these feelings together, but I understand why you didn't. Sometimes the things we keep private aren't secrets so much as sacred spaces, places we go to be fully ourselves without having to explain or justify. I want you to know that I'm not angry anymore. I'm sad that you carried this alone for so long, sad that you felt you couldn't share this part of yourself with me, but I am also appreciative. Grateful that you chose me, even if it was a complicated choice. Grateful for our 53 years together. Grateful that you loved me truly, even if not simply. I love the man who questioned his decisions, but continued to show up every day, who grieved for decades for his friend, and who, in the end, was sure that he had lived the right life. These letters show me who you were when you were by yourself with your thoughts. Thank you for our life together, Walter. Thank you for choosing me, even when it was hard. We are grateful for the grandchildren, the garden, the morning coffee, and all the small, lovely moments that filled our days. I'm grateful that you loved me as best you could. I signed it, folded it, and placed it in an envelope, but I didn't seal it. Instead, I placed it in Walter's box, adding another letter to his collection, another exchange of letters between two people who genuinely and imperfectly loved one another. The next morning, I drove to the cemetery. I hadn't been since the funeral. I'd been avoiding it, unable to face the physical reality of Walter's absence. But now I had something to tell him, something he needed to hear. His grave was in the newer section, the stone simple and clean, Walter Hayes, beloved husband and father. The grass had grown in over the disturbed earth. Someone, probably David, had left flowers in the holder, but they'd wilted. I threw them away and sat down on the ground beside the stone, not caring that the damp grass would stain my pants. I found your letters, I said aloud. A woman walking her dog on the cemetery path gave me a strange look, but I didn't care. All those letters to Tommy. I know about the choice you made. I am aware of the life you did not lead. Fall was approaching, and these trees would soon be stripped of their leaves as a breeze rustled the leaves. I want you to know that I understand. You have my forgiveness, even though you don't need it. And even though a part of you wanted something else, I want to thank you for choosing me. My voice broke. We appreciate you remaining, creating our life, and being there each and every day. I appreciate you loving me as best you could. We all have alternate lives, I told him. We all make choices and wonder. I stayed there for a long time talking to Walter, telling him things I'd never said while he was alive, telling him about my own little regrets, the poetry I'd hidden, the painting class I'd skipped, and how I'd occasionally wondered what my life would have been like if I'd gone after my teaching degree, if I'd taken that job in Boston instead of staying in our hometown. Even though it had taken Walter decades to be sure of it himself, I was now positive that the life we had chosen together was the right one. When I finally stood up to leave, my knees protesting the long sit, I felt lighter. Not happy exactly, but at peace in a way I hadn't been since I'd found the letters. In the weeks that followed, I read the letters again and again, discovering new information and meanings, and I also began to do some research, finding online Thomas Brennan's obituary and images of his artwork, abstract paintings full of color and movement, beautiful in a way that helped me understand why Walter had been drawn to him, as well as references to his foster children, gallery showings, awards, and partner Michael. Tommy had lived a good life. Different from Walter's, but equally valuable. Neither of them had made the wrong choice. They'd simply made different choices, and both had led to lives worth living. I was sitting in Walter's chair one afternoon, I guess it was my chair now, when the doorbell rang and Barbara from next door came in with another casserole. She pushed past me into the kitchen and said, "You look thin, Margaret. I thought you might need something for dinner." I wasn't thin. If anything, I'd gained weight from all the casseroles. But I accepted this one graciously, as I'd learned to do. Barbara took a seat at my kitchen table, obviously eager to talk. "How are things going for you?" "The grief, I mean," she inquired. "Is it getting any easier?" I thought about that question, the same question everyone asked, assuming there was a simple answer, a linear progression from pain to peace. "It's getting different," I finally said, "more complicated, not exactly easier. I'm learning things that I didn't know before." "That's grief for you," Barbara said, nodding wisely, but I could tell she didn't fully comprehend. "It changes over time," she said. "You'll be prepared to move on eventually." I wanted to stay in this complex place, learning about Walter and our marriage in new ways, but I didn't want to move on because it felt like I was leaving him again, like I was choosing to forget. I went back to the letters after Barbara left. I had read them all before, several times, but I kept discovering new things, phrases that made me think in a different way. For example, in a 1989 letter, Walter wrote, "Today, I heard a song that reminded me of the summer we were 17, sitting by the lake, making plans we'd never keep. And for a moment, I was back there, believing anything was possible." The song came to an end, and I found myself here, 42 years old, with a good life. Tommy, it's excellent. However, I'm happy that I can still remember those summers. That was it, I knew. That was what the letters were, not a sign of regret or discontent, but a means for Walter to hold two or more truths at once. The truth of his imagined life and the truth of our life together. The truth of his love for me and his friend's absence. The truth of contentment and the truth of wondering what might have been. Even in death, even through words he'd never intended for me to hear, Walter had taught me that people are complex and contain multitudes of emotions. We spend so much time trying to simplify our feelings, to pick one emotion and stick with it. I made the decision to write more letters of my own. I wrote to Tommy, introducing myself and telling him about the man Walter had become. I wrote to my younger self, the 21-year-old girl who had married a man with secrets she was unaware of, telling her that everything would be okay and that the love would be genuine even if it was complicated. And I wrote to Walter, processing my feelings and asking him questions I had never asked him while he was alive. Despite the fact that none of these letters would be sent either, I found that writing them helped me make sense of the complex feelings I had been carrying around ever since I discovered Walter's box. When Claire visited in October, she brought the grandchildren, Jack, age 6, and Emma, age 8, who ran around the house like kids who had been stuck in a car for too long, their energy and noise filling the void I had become accustomed to. Claire and I sat in the living room drinking tea after dinner, after we had put the kids to bed in the guest room. "Have you perused additional letters?" she inquired. "Every one of them, several times." "And?" I put my hands around my mug and felt its warmth as I said, "And I understand now. Your father loved me. He genuinely cared for me. But in his heart he also held this other life, this other love. And that's all right. It doesn't take away from what we had. It simply indicates that he was a human." After a brief period of silence, Claire asked, "Do you wish he had told you, when he was living?" I had given this question a lot of thought. "I don't know," I said, admitting that I wished we could have discussed it and shared that burden. However, another part of him knows why he didn't. Not because they are embarrassing, but because they belong to us. There are some things we must keep private, somewhat sacred. How are you going to handle the letters? I intend to retain them, and I'll give them to you and David when you're ready. They are a part of both your father's and your own histories. Not yet, though. They're mine for now. My method of reestablishing contact with Walter and comprehending the depth of my spouse's complexity." Taking my hand, Claire said, "I think you're being very brave about all this, Mom. I'm not feeling courageous. I feel like I'm trying to make sense of something I don't fully understand while stumbling in the dark." "That's what bravery is," Claire said quietly. "Moving forward even when you don't know the way." I had been so preoccupied with Walter's absence that I had failed to think about what his absence might open up. What space might now be available for me to develop, to change, to become something new. The house felt empty after Claire and the kids left. But it was a different kind of empty. Not the hollow absence of loss, but the spacious emptiness of possibility. I returned to the attic and took out boxes that I hadn't seen in years, boxes containing my personal belongings and history. I discovered my college notebooks, which contained poetry I'd written in my 20s, sketches I'd made during the year I considered becoming an art teacher, letters I'd received from friends who had moved away, and relationships I'd allowed to wane as I'd established my life with Walter. Walter's letters and my own forgotten past were on opposite sides of the dining room table, which I spread out after bringing everything downstairs. 2 lives, 2 sets of what-ifs and might-have-beens. I resumed writing after that, but this time it was poetry rather than letters, the kind I'd written when I was 20, before I'd learned to be pragmatic, before I'd buried that side of myself. The words came slowly at first, rusty from decades of neglect, but they came. I wrote about Walter, our life together, and our complex love. About Tommy, the stranger who had influenced my marriage in ways I had never known. About being 74 and learning that the person I had shared a home with for 53 years had hidden dimensions. I wrote about grief, not as a straightforward journey from suffering to acceptance, but as a complex dance of emotions that defied easy categorization, and about being a widow, about the odd liberation that comes from having only oneself to think about. I had no illusions that the poetry was good, but it was mine, and that was what counted. When Barbara came over one afternoon, I was buried in papers, with my reading glasses balanced on my nose and totally engrossed in writing. She exclaimed, "Margaret," in shock. "What are you doing?" I said, "Writing poetry," and it felt liberating to admit it. "Song? How old are you?" "Why not at my age?" I chuckled. "I'm still alive." Barbara appeared uneasy, as though I had said something unsuitable, but I didn't give a damn. I was sick of living up to the expectations of others about what a 74-year-old widow ought to be doing. I joined a library writing group full of people my age, all with stories to share, emotions to work through, and words that needed a voice. I read aloud some of my poems, my voice trembling the first time, getting stronger the second time, and people listened, some crying, and then one woman, Helen, approached me. "I lost my husband 6 years ago," she said. "I felt exactly the same way you described in your post about grief being complex, and realizing you didn't know someone as well as you believed. I appreciate you saying that." That's when I realized that Walter had been using his letters to process, comprehend, and make sense of his life, and that I was doing the same. We were more alike than I had thought. Winter arrived. On a Tuesday morning, the garden was blanketed in white snow, obscuring Walter's roses. As I stood at the window, sipping coffee, I observed the world change and reflected on the letter Walter had written to Tommy following his passing, in which he discussed how our lives were depicted in memories rather than on canvas. I came to see that our life had been a work of art, not the kind that was displayed in galleries, but the kind that existed in the moments that were accumulated. Morning coffee, evening strolls, hands clasped across the dinner table, Walter kissing my forehead before he left for work, my making his favorite pie on his birthday, 53 years of little acts that added up to something lovely. Yes, Walter had considered other options. Yes, he had lamented the life he had not lived. But he had also shown up for the life he had chosen, every day that was significant. That was significant for everything. I returned to the cemetery on what would have been our 54th anniversary, bringing flowers this time. Not the wilted carnations from the gas station, but gorgeous roses from the florist, in the red, pink, and white hues Walter had always picked for me. I sat down next to it after placing them in the holder by his stone. "I've been writing poetry," I informed him. "The type I wrote while I was in college. Do you recall the times you made fun of my artistic phase? It's back then. Additionally, I'm no longer hiding it." The winter wind, cold but not unpleasant, blew through the bare trees. "What you wrote in your last letter about your life being the right one has been on my mind," I added. "It was the right choice for me as well, and I want you to know that it was the right life, despite all the difficulties, all the things we kept hidden, and all the things we didn't say." I took out a sheet of paper I had packed and a poem I had penned the previous evening. "I wrote this for you," I said, and then I read it aloud. "You kept your letters in a box in the attic, feelings never shared, words never sent. You loved in secret the friend you'd left behind, privately lamented the life you had not experienced. And when I discovered them, I was furious. The idea that I had been a second choice was hurtful. Consolation prize, everyday existence. When adventure called, you had made do with what you had, but now I see there are multitudes within each of us. With complete love, we can still wonder what might have been. We can respect the other paths while selecting one. Still bear the specters of lives we never had." You spent 52 years writing to Tommy. During the quiet of our mornings, I wrote to you, in the kids we brought up, in the garden we planted, in moments accumulated over 53 years. My letters were unlabeled, and yours were unsent. However, in their own ways, both were love letters. Both were efforts to maintain several truths: satisfaction and remorse, existence and non-existence, the lives that we led and the ones that we did not, all real, all true, all existing together. You loved what could have been as much as you loved me, and I still love you completely and complicatedly. After folding the poem and putting it under the flowers, I stood up slowly, my knees protesting, and took another look at Walter's stone as the wind grew stronger and the snow began to scatter across the cemetery. "Happy anniversary," I replied. "I'll see you next time." I considered the future as I made my way back to my car, not the future Walter and I had planned, the retirement trips we would never take, the grandchild's graduations we would never attend together, the peaceful old age we would never experience together, but rather my future, the years I still had left, the life I had to mold. If I was lucky, I might live another 10 or 15 years, which would give me enough time to write more poetry, enroll in that painting class I had always wanted, and perhaps travel to some of the places Walter had described in his letters: Paris, Rome, the places Tommy had visited that had seemed so far away by being brave enough to be complex, to contain multitudes, to love what was while acknowledging what might have been. I could honor Walter's memory without drowning in grief and instead live life to the fullest. In the time I had left, I had learned from the letters that love doesn't need to be flawless, that we can be committed and still be unsure, and that we can create something lovely while lamenting what we've lost. That was the gift Walter had left me, even though he'd never meant for me to discover it. The house would be empty when I arrived, but it wouldn't feel as empty as it had 6 months prior. Instead, it would feel like space to develop, space to transform, space to become whoever I was meant to be at 74. I drove home through the snow, the world white and clean and full of possibilities. I would preserve Walter's letters, read them occasionally, and allow them to serve as a reminder of the complex man I had loved. But I would also write my own letters now, my own poetry, my own tale. We write our lives in permanent ink, knowing that we can't go back and change the plot once it's written, but we keep going forward, pen in hand, hoping that the story we're telling is one worth reading. That's because that's what we do. People we love, regrets we carry, joys we discover, and decisions we make all write our lives. Both stories are true, valid, and, in their own unique ways, love letters to the lovely, complex, messy miracle that is human. Walter wrote his story in unsent letters, and I'm writing mine in poetry. In this peaceful home, in the years I have left, the world continues to turn. The snow continues to fall outside my window, and I continue to write, live, and learn how to be both fully myself and carry Walter with me. It's not easy, but nothing worthwhile ever is. And that's all there is to it. It's more than enough.